Could you tell why you're taking this plane? Couldn't you get a reservation?
Yes, I could get a reservation, but my doctor suggested it because I can't stand it all, and he thought there'd be so many people and so many of you gentlemen.
She inherited a fortune that would be worth nearly $1 billion today, married 7 times, and lived in palaces around the world. Yet she died alone with almost nothing left. This is Wealth, Love, and Loneliness, the downfall of Barbara Hutton. Barbara Woolworth Hutton was born on November 14, 1912, in New York City into a world of extraordinary privilege. Her maternal grandfather was Frank Winfield Woolworth, founder of the Woolworth five and dime stores that had become an empire across America. Her father was Franklin Laws Hutton, co-founder of E.F. Hutton and Company, one of New York's most respected investment banking and stock brokerage firms. Barbara was also niece by marriage to serial heiress Marjorie Merriweather Post, making her first cousin to actress Dinah Merrill. The Hutton and Woolworth families represented American wealth at its peak. But all the money in the world couldn't buy Barbara a happy childhood. Her father was a masterful businessman, but an abysmal family man. Franklin Hutton was a heavy drinker and an unabashed philanderer who kept multiple mistresses. He treated his wife, Edna Woolworth Hutton, terribly. He was rarely home, and when he was, he made everyone miserable. The marriage was poisoned by his behavior, and Edna grew lonely and desperate. Edna began her own affair with Bud Bouvier, the youngest brother of John Vernon Bouvier, who would later become the father of Jacqueline Kennedy. But the affair couldn't heal the damage that had been done. Edna was deeply unhappy and her mental state deteriorated. On May 2nd, 1917, when Barbara was just 4 years old, Edna was found dead in her bedroom. The official cause of death was listed as suffocation due to mastoiditis, a chronic ear infection. But rumors persisted that Edna had committed suicide by poison. The coroner decided that no autopsy was necessary, and according to biographer C. David Heyman, it's widely believed that the family paid off city officials to avoid an investigation. 4-year-old Barbara was the one who discovered her mother's body. She tried to wake her mother that morning, approaching the side of the bed, and made a horrifying discovery. The trauma of that moment haunted Barbara for the rest of her life. She would spend decades trying to fill the void her mother's death left behind, and she would never succeed. After Edna's death, Franklin Hutton essentially abandoned his daughter. He continued his philandering ways and spent most of his time focused on his business and his mistresses. Barbara was passed around to various relatives and raised primarily by governesses. She had nurses and staff attending to her physical needs, but no one who genuinely loved her. For a time, she lived with her cousin Marjorie Merriweather Post and her husband E.F. Hutton at their estate. Dinah Merrill, who would become a famous actress, later recalled on A.E.'s biography that Barbara lived with them following the death of her mother and abandonment by her father. But even in their home, Barbara felt like an outsider, a temporary guest rather than the part of a family. She attended Miss Hewitt's classes in New York's Lenox Hill neighborhood and later Miss Porter's School for Girls in Farmington, Connecticut. These were prestigious schools where the daughters of America's wealthiest families were educated. Barbara was surrounded by girls from similar backgrounds, but she never fit in. She was an introverted child who had limited interaction with other children her own age. The trauma of finding her mother's body made her withdrawn and fearful. She built walls around herself that few people could penetrate. Her closest friend and only real confidant was her cousin Jimmy Donahue, the son of her mother's sister. Jimmy inherited a portion of the Woolworth estate along with Barbara. Like her, he'd grown up knowing that people wanted him for his money rather than for himself. He would grow up to have his own notorious problems with drugs, alcohol, and relationships. The two of them understood each other in a way no one else could. They were both poor little rich children, surrounded by wealth but starved for genuine affection. They could be honest with each other about the emptiness they felt, the way their lives looked perfect from the outside while being hollow on the inside. When Barbara turned 21 in 1933, she inherited 1/3 of her grandfather, Frank Woolworth's estate. By then, her father had been managing her trust and had grown it substantially, pulling out of the stock market before the 1929 crash. Barbara's inheritance was worth approximately $50 million, which would be equivalent to around $900 million today. She was one of the wealthiest women in the world. She could buy anything she wanted, go anywhere she pleased, and do whatever struck her fancy. But she couldn't buy the one thing she desperately needed: love. In 1930, when Barbara was 18, she made her formal debut into society. Her father threw her a lavish coming-out party at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in New York. It was during the darkest depths of the Great Depression when millions of Americans were out of work and standing in bread lines. The timing couldn't have been worse. The newspapers seized on the contrast between Barbara's extravagant celebration and the suffering of ordinary people. They dubbed her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life. The nickname was meant to be sarcastic at first, a jab at the obscene wealth being flaunted during desperate times. But as the years went on and Barbara's troubled personal life became public knowledge, the phrase took on a different meaning. She truly was a poor little rich girl, someone who had everything money could buy but nothing that really mattered. In the summer of 1933, Barbara married her first husband, Prince Alexis Madivani. The marriage was a disaster from the very beginning, and it set the pattern for the 6 marriages that would follow. Alexis was a Georgian nobleman who claimed to be a prince, though his title was questionable at best. He and his siblings, known as the marrying Madivanis, had fled Tbilisi in 1921 during the Soviet invasion of Georgia. They held the rank of Aznauri, which was untitled Georgian nobility, but they promoted themselves as princes once they arrived in the West. Once in the West, they made a profession of marrying wealthy Americans. It was a calculated strategy, and all the Mdivani siblings pursued it relentlessly. Alexis was already married to Louise Van Allen, a member of the Astor family and a friend Barbara had met at Bailey's Beach in Rhode Island when he met Barbara in Biarritz, France. The meeting was engineered by Alexis's manipulative sister, Isabel Rasadana Madivani, known as Rusi. Rosie was the mastermind behind the family's social climbing. She was always propelling her family into wealthy marriages, even if a divorce was required to make it happen. Rousey and Alexis devised a plan that would enable Alexis to divorce Louise, seduce Barbara, and force her into marriage all at once. The plan worked perfectly. Rousey befriended Barbara and began singing her brother's praises. She arranged situations where Alexis and Barbara would be thrown together. She made Barbara feel special, chosen. And then, when Barbara was sufficiently infatuated, Rousey delivered the worst kind of threat imaginable. She threatened to destroy Barbara's image with bad publicity if she refused to marry Alexis. Barbara was only 20 years old and terrified of scandal. Young and naive, she fell straight into the trap and agreed to marry him. On their wedding night, Alexis looked at his new bride and told her something that shattered her confidence. He said she was too fat. It was a calculated cruelty designed to undermine her self-esteem and make her easier to control. Barbara, deeply hurt by the criticism, took his words to heart. From that day forward, she was always on a diet. She became obsessed with her weight, restricting her eating more and more. She developed anorexia nervosa, a condition that would plague her for the rest of her life and eventually prevent her from having more children after her first son. Her body never recovered from the damage. Alexis used Barbara's fortune freely during their marriage, spending lavishly on himself while showing her little affection. The marriage lasted just 2 years. In 1935, Alexis died in a car crash in Spain. Barbara was 23 years old and already a widow. She inherited some of her money back from Alexis's estate, but she'd learned a hard lesson about what men wanted from her. In 1935, Barbara married Count Kurt von Haugwitz Hardenberg-Reventlow, a Danish nobleman. This marriage would prove even worse than the first. Kurt dominated Barbara through verbal and physical abuse. He was violent and controlling, and the abuse escalated over time. On one occasion, he beat Barbara so savagely that she had to be hospitalized, and he was arrested and jailed. But Barbara didn't leave him immediately. She was trapped in the cycle that so many abuse victims know too well. Kurt also persuaded Barbara to give up her American citizenship in 1937 and take Danish citizenship for tax purposes. The decision sparked outrage across America. Barbara's renunciation of her citizenship was seen as a betrayal of the country that had provided her fortune. Walter Winchell took to the airwaves, calling her society's most outrageous child. The New York Times thought her despicable. The American public turned on her viciously. How dare she, they said, abandon America after taking so much from it. But there was one positive thing that came from the marriage to Kurt. On February 24, 1936, Barbara gave birth to her only child, a son named Lance. She nearly died in childbirth, and doctors told her she couldn't have more children. Lance became the center of Barbara's world, the one person she loved completely and unconditionally. She named the London house where he was born Winfield House, after her grandfather Frank Winfield Woolworth. The marriage to Kurt ended in a bitter divorce in 1938. The custody battle over Lance was brutal. Kurt wanted control of Barbara's money, and he used Lance as leverage. Eventually, Barbara won custody, but the emotional toll was devastating. Her anorexia worsened, and she turned increasingly to alcohol and prescription drugs to cope with her pain. In 1942, Barbara married for the third time. This time, her husband was someone who didn't need her money, Cary Grant, one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Grant was already wealthy and successful in his own right. He was at the peak of his career, starring in hit films and earning top dollar. The marriage seemed to offer Barbara a chance at something different, a partnership with someone who saw her as more than just an heiress. People were shocked when Grant, who could have had any woman in Hollywood, chose to marry Barbara Hutton. The couple was dubbed Cash and Carey by the press, a play on Grant's name and Barbara's wealth. It was a cruel nickname, but it stuck. The wedding took place on July 8, 1942, and Barbara wore a simple outfit, a white ruffled blouse with a striped dark coat dress. It was understated compared to her previous elaborate weddings, and that seemed like a good sign. Maybe this marriage would be different. Grant was kind to Barbara and formed a close bond with young Lance, becoming a true stepfather to him. He took the troubled 6-year-old under his wing and provided the male guidance Lance desperately needed. For a few years, Barbara seemed happier. She lived in California, far from the judgmental eyes of New York society. She attended Hollywood parties and mingled with movie stars. Grant was a good husband by all accounts, patient and caring. He tried to help Barbara with her eating disorder and her drinking. He wanted her to be healthy and happy. But even Cary Grant couldn't fill the void inside Barbara. She continued to struggle with anorexia, alcoholism, and drug abuse. The demons that haunted her were too deeply rooted for love alone to fix. Grant grew frustrated watching his wife destroy herself. He tried everything he could think of, but Barbara wouldn't or couldn't change. The marriage lasted only 3 years, ending in divorce on July 11th, 1945. Of all Barbara's 7 husbands, Cary Grant was the only one who left her as rich as he'd found her. He didn't take a penny in the divorce settlement. He wanted nothing from her except for her to be well, and since he couldn't give her that, he walked away. He also remained close to Lance even after the marriage ended, maintaining a relationship with him throughout his life. When Lance died in 1972, Grant attended his memorial service. After Grant, Barbara married 4 more times, each marriage shorter and more disastrous than the last. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian nobleman and race car driver who had fled his homeland during the Bolshevik Revolution. Igor was charming and handsome, and he introduced 12-year-old Lance to the world of Grand Prix motor racing when he won the Targa Florio in 1948. Lance was fascinated by the speed and danger of racing, and it would become his passion. But the marriage between Barbara and Igor was troubled from the start. He spent her money freely and showed little genuine affection. The marriage lasted 4 years before ending in divorce in 1951. In 1953, Barbara married Porfirio Rubirosa, a notorious international playboy and diplomat from the Dominican Republic. Rubirosa was famous for his affairs with wealthy women and his extravagant lifestyle. He had previously been married to tobacco heiress Doris Duke, who was considered Barbara's arch rival among American heiresses. Duke had showered Rubirosa with gifts during their marriage: sports cars, polo ponies, a plantation in his native Dominican Republic, a converted B-25 bomber, a 17th century home in Paris, and $25,000 a year for life in their divorce settlement. Duke never remarried after Rubirosa, perhaps learning her lesson. Barbara apparently didn't learn from Duke's example. She gave Rubirosa $3.5 million and another converted B-25 bomber when they divorced less than a year later. It was one of the shortest and most expensive of her marriages. Rubirosa spent Barbara's money freely and showed her no real affection. He was interested in her bank account, not her heart. The marriage was over almost as soon as it began, leaving Barbara even more disillusioned about love. In 1955, Barbara married Baron Gottfried von Cram, a German tennis champion. That marriage lasted 4 years. Her seventh and final marriage was to Pierre Raymond Doan, a Vietnamese prince, in 1964. They divorced in 1966. By then, Barbara was 54 years old and completely exhausted by her failed attempts at finding love. Throughout all these marriages, the pattern was the same. Barbara chose men with titles but little money. They used her wealth to fund their lifestyles, treated her poorly, and left her when the marriage ended. She gave them millions in divorce settlements, expensive gifts, homes, cars, and airplanes. She was desperate for love and willing to pay any price to get it. But money couldn't buy what she needed. On July 24, 1972, Barbara's worst nightmare came true. Her son Lance, who was 36 years old, was killed in a plane crash near Aspen, Colorado. Lance had become a successful race car driver and entrepreneur. He designed and built the Scarab racing car in Venice, California, working with engineer Phil Remington and designers Tom Barnes and Dick Troutman. The Scarab had beaten Ferraris and Maseratis in competition. Lance had won the International Grand Prix in Nassau in 1958, the first American to do so in 30 years. He'd become friends with fellow car enthusiast James Dean and had been one of the last people to see Dean alive, speaking with him just minutes before the crash that killed the iconic actor. Lance had married actress Jill St. John in 1960, and they'd been a glamorous Hollywood couple, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1963. His love of racing and refusal to give it up had contributed to the split. In 1964, he married Cheryl Holdridge, a former Mouseketeer, in a lavish Hollywood ceremony attended by 600 guests. Barbara was too ill to attend her son's wedding, but she gave the couple a 5-bedroom home on 21 acres in Benedict Canyon worth $500,000. By then, Lance had given up racing and was focusing on polo and skiing. He seemed to be settling into a quieter, happier life. That day in July, Lance was scouting locations for a ski resort he wanted to build in Aspen. He was an experienced pilot himself with thousands of hours of flying time, fully rated for instrument flight rules on multi-engine planes. But that day, he was a passenger in a single-engine Cessna 206, piloted by a 27-year-old student pilot named Gifford Hooker, who had only 39 hours of flying time total. The plane took off from the Aspen airport a little before 6 in the evening. Also aboard were Robert Wolf, a ski instructor, and Barbara Baker. As the group flew over the Rocky Mountains, a thunderstorm was brewing. The inexperienced pilot flew into a blind canyon in minimal visibility. When he realized his mistake and tried to turn around, the plane stalled and plunged into a heavily wooded mountainside 8 miles from the nearest road. All 4 people aboard were killed instantly. According to the NTSB report, the crash was the result of pilot error, high winds, and severe thunderstorms. It was a senseless tragedy that never should have happened. Cary Grant attended Lance's memorial service. Barbara, by then a recluse, didn't show up. She couldn't face it. The death of her only child sent Barbara into a state of complete despair from which she would never recover. Lance had been the one bright spot in her life, the one relationship that had been real and unconditional. With him gone, Barbara had nothing left to live for. In her last years, Barbara became a shadow of the beautiful woman she'd once been. She spent most of her time in bed at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, drinking Coca-Cola and chain smoking. She was painfully thin from decades of anorexia. The spirit was gone. The life was gone out of her, as designer Oleg Cassini remembered. Barbara had squandered one of America's greatest fortunes. A combination of lavish spending, bad investments, and exploitation by those entrusted to manage her estate brought her to the verge of bankruptcy. She'd given away money to strangers on the street. She'd bought palaces in multiple countries and filled them with priceless art, jewelry, and antiques. She'd owned the 40-carat Pasha diamond, pieces that had belonged to Marie Antoinette and Empress Eugénie of France, and important works by Fabergé and Cartier. She'd collected old master paintings and valuable sculptures, but she'd also spent recklessly and been cheated repeatedly by advisors and husbands. Barbara was surrounded by people on her payroll, sycophants who told her what she wanted to hear. She refused to get out of bed. Her cousin Dina Merrill and Dina's husband, actor Cliff Robertson, visited her frequently in those final years. Robertson recalled that each time they visited, Barbara was in bed, surrounded by half-empty glasses of Coke and books. She was definitely alert, but you could see her frailness. It was a sad thing, he said. She had a sweet, lost quality, a sensitivity. She also had a strong and determined mind. She was a virtual cocoon. On May 11, 1979, Barbara Hutton suffered a heart attack and died in her penthouse suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. She was 66 years old. According to her biographer, Barbara had only $3,500 in her bank account at the time of her death. The woman who had inherited the equivalent of $900 million died nearly broke. Only 16 people attended her funeral. She was interred in the Woolworth family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York, near her mother and grandfather. The turnout was a stark reminder of how isolated Barbara had become. All her money, all her beauty, all her fame had meant nothing in the end. Barbara Hutton's life is one of the most tragic stories in American history. She was born with every advantage money could provide, yet she died alone and impoverished. Poet Ogden Nash captured something essential about her in a light verse that circulated during her lifetime, noting how the public followed her scandalous private life with fascination. What went wrong? How did someone with so much end up with so little? The answer is complicated, but it starts with the trauma of her childhood. Finding her mother's body at age 4, being abandoned by her father, being raised by governesses instead of parents, these experiences shaped everything that came after. Barbara never learned what healthy love looked like. She didn't know how to recognize when someone genuinely cared for her versus when they were using her. Her marriages followed a pattern. She chose men with impressive titles but empty pockets. They saw her as a bank account, not a person. They exploited her desperate need for affection and took everything they could. Barbara knew she was being used. She wasn't stupid. But she was so lonely, so hungry for love, that she convinced herself each new marriage would be different. The press and public weren't kind to her either. They mocked her failed marriages, criticized her spending, and condemned her for renouncing her citizenship. During the Depression, when people were struggling to survive, Barbara became a symbol of everything wrong with American wealth. People resented her privilege and felt justified in tearing her down. The poor little rich girl nickname that started as mockery eventually became accurate. She was poor in all the ways that mattered. Barbara's struggles with anorexia, alcoholism, and prescription drug abuse were symptoms of deeper pain. She was trying to numb herself, to escape from the emptiness she felt. The more she spent, the more she gave away. The more she tried to buy love and happiness, the more isolated she became. Money became both her blessing and her curse. In 1987, NBC produced a television miniseries called Poor Little Rich Girl: The Barbara Hutton Story, starring Farrah Fawcett as Barbara. The film portrayed her as a victim of social climbers and fortune hunters, which she was. But Barbara was also a victim of her own inability to break free from destructive patterns. She kept making the same mistakes, marrying the same type of man, hoping for a different outcome. Barbara Hutton's story is a reminder that money cannot buy the things that matter most: love, health, peace of mind, and genuine human connection. She had wealth that most people can't even imagine, but she would have traded it all for a loving family and a life free from pain. In the end, she got neither. Her grave is at Woodlawn Cemetery, and few people visit it today. Most people under 50 have never heard of Barbara Hutton, but those who remember her story know it as one of the great American tragedies. A woman who had everything and nothing, all at the same time. If you enjoyed learning about Barbara Hutton's remarkable and heartbreaking story, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating stories from history. Share your thoughts about Barbara in the comments below. Thanks for watching.